All right. So, for those of you who have been coming to all, if this is the first time in the series you're coming, don't worry. You don't need to have been at the first two to appreciate this one. But if you were here for the first two, I'll just start by making a brief contrast. The events we looked at in the first two sessions, these were events that happened a long time ago. The expulsion from Spain, more than 500 years. The destruction of the temple, a long time ago. Incidentally, wouldn't it have been something if we had done the destruction of the temple tonight, on the night before Tisha B'Av? I don't know how I missed that one. Opportunity lost. In any case, those happened a long time ago, which means it was easier to answer the question, what if it didn't happen? Because we have a lot of historical perspective on what did happen and its impact. This evening, we're dealing with two events that happened a lot more recently, especially the second one. So the first, the Uganda plan, and what if the Zionists had accepted it. That happened just 120 years ago. Okay, so we've got some perspective. But our main question for this evening, what if the Palestinians had accepted the partition? It did happen in 1947, which isn't just yesterday. But first of all, in the larger scheme of history, it's not that recent. But also, that's a decision whose impact we have not come to the end yet. We're still in the middle. We're still living in the wake of that decision, which doesn't make it impossible to explore this. It just makes it a little bit more difficult. I guess what I'm saying as a disclaimer at the beginning is when you talk about today anything about Israel and the Palestinians, especially as we get more recent, you move from the realm of historical perspective a little bit more into speculation. So I'm just going to put that out there. Okay. So with that in mind, let's turn to our topic tonight. Everybody has a handout, I hope. So let's turn to our topic tonight. We're going to look at two questions, two what-if questions. What if the Zionists had said yes to Uganda, which I will explain in a moment? What if the Palestinians had said yes to partition? Now, these are two events that happened, that happened 40 years plus apart, but they are related in the sense that either, in combination, if these two events had gone differently, there might not be a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians today. Keeping in mind that if the Zionists had chosen somewhere else, if the Jews had settled for somewhere else, things would have been different. And if the Palestinians had been willing to share, things would have been different. So we're going to look at both of those. I also know that, especially the latter question, this is a question that people have very strong feelings about. And when we get to the questions at the end, I welcome your questions. Please, absolutely. But let me just finish my spiel first. Let me give my bit of perspective, and then we can turn to the questions. Okay. So let's look at the Uganda part of this first. I think of the two questions, this is by far the more straightforward question to address, not only because it's older, but because the issues were more straightforward. So it comes down to this. As you may know, in 1903, 6 years after the first Zionist Congress, which was in 1897, and 20 years after the beginning of Zionism in 1881, the British government made an offer to the Zionist movement. They said, oh, we hear you Jews are looking for a homeland, a sovereign territory, and we know you're interested in Palestine, but how about Uganda, which then was called British East Africa? We've got this piece of land in Africa that's, let's call it a European or British point of view. It's just sitting there and no one's there, which of course is a European fallacy, but would you like that instead? And that became a matter of debate within the Zionist movement. So let me read to you what the offer was, and then we can talk a little bit about what the debate was over. So if you look at page 1 on your handout, this is a copy of the letter, the Uganda plan, sent by a representative of the British government. Okay? Basically, it's the government making this announcement. Mr. Chamberlain communicated to the Marquis of Lansdowne the letter which you addressed, blah, 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 blah. Skipping down to the third paragraph. I am now directed by his lordship to say that he has studied the question with the interest which his majesty's government must always take in any well-considered scheme for the amelioration of the position of the Jewish race. But in those days, they used the word race then the way we would use the word ethnicity. I mean, that was the concept of race. But when they said Jewish race, they weren't using it in a sort of Hitler kind of way. They were using it in a softer, neutral kind of way. It doesn't necessarily make it any better. The time at his disposal has been too short to enable him to go fully into details of the plan or to discuss it with His Majesty's Commissioner for the East Africa Protectorate, and he regrets that he is therefore unable to pronounce any definite opinion. He understands, well, skip one more paragraph. If a site can be found which the Trust and His Majesty's Commissioner consider suitable and which commends itself to His Majesty's government, Lord Land's-Own will be prepared to entertain favorably proposals for the establishment of a Jewish colony or settlement on conditions which will enable the members to observe their national customs. In other words, a Jewish colony where Jews, if not having sovereignty, will at least have autonomy. Now, you might think, well, obviously the Zionists just said no. Well, eventually they did, but at first they didn't. And among the leaders of the Zionist movement who said yes initially were none other than Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl thought about it. Now, why would Theodor Herzl think about it? Well, first of all, this wasn't the first time that Jews were offered this kind of territory. You know, before there was such a thing as Zionism, the issue with Jews really came down to a question of refugees. Jews are being persecuted somewhere or disenfranchised somewhere, and what they need is a place where they can go where they won't be persecuted or disenfranchised, where they'll be left alone, they can live in peace. And long before the Uganda plan, there were other proposals to do just that. Let me give you one really odd example from right here in America. In the 18-teens, around the year 1815, there was a prominent American Jew whose name was Mordechai Manuel Noah, who proposed a plan called the Ararat Plan. Now, Ararat is in reference to that story in that moment in the book of Genesis. Ararat is the place where Noah's Ark landed. Now, wherever it is, it's probably somewhere in the Middle East, but he wasn't calling the Ararat plan because he wanted to give the actual place where Noah landed. Ararat is the notion of a refuge. That's where the Ark found refuge after the months and months of the flood and the rain. Now, the Ararat project really consisted of taking land, which is today in and around Niagara Falls, and turning that into a Jewish colony. And Noah said this will be a place where Jews who are living in difficult situations, whether in Russia or in Romania or in the Middle East or wherever it is, they can come and live here. It was a very nice idea. Ultimately, it went nowhere. Okay? And in some sense, the Uganda plan was a later version of that. Incidentally, in the 1880s, when Jews began to leave Russia following pogroms and anti-Semitic laws, there was an organization called the Am Olam organization, People of the World, and this was a settlement movement or a settlement organization which, like the Ararat plan, simply tried to find places for Jews to go and settle. North America, like in Western Canada, South America, various places. Where can Jews find refuge? I mention all of this because even in the mind of Theodor Herzl, an important dimension of Zionism, apart from the need for Jews to have a sovereign Jewish state in the land of Israel, was the more practical question of finding Jews a refuge from anti-Semitism right now. You know, the term they used for this in the Zionist movement, the German/Yiddish term, was Gegenwartsarbeit. Gegenwart means the present. Arbeit means work. Work in the present. In other words, Gegenwartsarbeit was a term that said we can't just think of the long-term goal of eventually having statehood, eventually having a place for Jews to go. That's important. We should do that. But while we're doing that, we should also work to improve the condition of Jews in the present. So to understand the whole notion, or the appeal, at least the initial short-term appeal of the Uganda plan, we have to see it in the context of this search for a refuge being an immediate pressing aim, and very much in the spirit or under the rubric of Gegenwartsarbeit, working in the present, solving that problem right now. Now, for Zionists, Gegenwartsarbeit did not necessarily mean abandoning the aim of statehood in the land of Israel. It simply was a way of saying, let's try to do two things at once. Let's solve this problem, the problem of homelessness, the problem of refugees, the problem of persecution, while we continue the more long-term process of building or establishing a homeland. Do both things at once. Now, and Herzl was very much aware of this. Let me give you a couple of examples of the way Herzl expressed this. First of all, there were some who said that the problem of Jews being persecuted in Russia will be alleviated by the fact that Jews we don't have to create a refuge for them because they already have a refuge. Until the end of the First World War, that was the United States, and there were other places Jews could go. So why do we need to create a refuge for Jews when we already have one called America? Okay? This is what Herzl thought about that. Look at your handout. Look at text number 1, which is on page 2. This is one of the first things Herzl wrote about something specifically Jewish. An essay he wrote that was published in the Jewish Chronicle in London called A Solution to the Jewish Question. Okay? And this is text number 1. Quote, the Jewish question, but by the way, the Jewish question means, can Jews be part of a modern state and society? Okay? Figuring out if that's possible or not. The Jewish question still exists. It would be foolish to deny it. It exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers, which is a way of saying wherever Jews live, eventually there's going to be some anti-Semitism. Herzl believed that anti-Semitism was endemic to the diaspora. Here's the important phrase. Where it does not exist, it will be brought by Jews in the course of their migrations. We naturally move to those places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence produces persecution. There he's talking about, among other places, America. He said, yeah, go to America in the 1880s, not a lot of anti-Semitism there, but if enough Jews move there, eventually there's going to be some backlash. He wrote this in 1896, at a point when no one really even imagined. There was very little anti-Semitism in America. By the way, this was also true of Hungary. This was also true of most of Western Europe. There wasn't a lot of anti-Semitism yet, really until after the First World War. Okay? This is true in every country and will remain true even in the most highly civilized. France is no exception. Remember, he wrote just after that the shocking experience of the Dreyfus affair, which means that to say Jews have a place to go and we can solve anti-Semitism that way, that doesn't hurt Herzl. That's not a good argument, because if enough Jews go anywhere, if enough Jews move to the South Pole, it's going to get anti-Semitic there somehow. That's Herzl's notion of the world. Maybe not the South Pole, but you get what I mean. Okay? And, he had a similar approach to the Uganda plan as well, both in why he initially embraced it and why ultimately he rejected it. Look at text number 2. Here's an essay he wrote called The Uganda Plan. So, first he's going to echo this notion of the need for a refuge. Quote, for the bloody days in that Bessarabian city, by which he meant Kishinev. Kishinev in Bessarabia was the site of the bloodiest pogrom in Russia prior to 1919. It got a lot worse then, but in 1903, the Kishinev pogrom was sort of the symbol of a bloody pogrom where a lot of Jews were killed. For the bloody days in that Bessarabian city must cause us to forget that there are many other Kishinevs, and not only in Russia. Kishinev exists wherever Jews are tortured physically or spiritually, where their self-respect is wounded, that their property is despoiled because they are Jews. Let us save those who can be saved. If we're being offered a solution now, let's take the solution now. This is the new era which we have entered. The countries of immigration have begun to fight back, because Jewish misery in Eastern Europe is increasing. In other words, Herzl was very prescient here, almost prophetic. He said, no, the United States is great for Jews now, but if enough Jews move there, and what Herzl was saying, they are going to change their mind about Jews being allowed to immigrate. He said this in 1903, and he was exactly right, because 20 years later, the United States did change its mind. Spot on. And all of this is a reason to accept this plan. Skip down to the bottom, the last 4 lines, talking about this Uganda. It says, Uganda is not and can never be Zion. It is merely an expedient for settlement purposes, but be it well understood on a national and political basis. It is and must remain only an emergency measure designed to allay the present helplessness of all the philanthropic undertakings and to keep us from losing scattered fragments of our people. Some Jews can't afford to wait decades for there to be a Jewish state. Okay? Now, it didn't pass. Ultimately, the Seventh Zionist Congress considered Uganda and rejected. Look at text number 3. The Zionist organization stands firmly by the fundamental principle of the Basel Program, namely the establishment of a legally secured, public recognized home for the Jewish people in Palestine, and rejects, either as a means or an end, all colonizing outside Palestine and its adjacent lands. No, we don't want Uganda. We are not settling for anything less than Palestine. But there was a segment within the Zionist movement led by an early Zionist named Israel Zangwill, who really echoed Herzl. He said, that's all well good, as an ideal to aspire for a Jewish state in the land of Israel. But like Herzl said, there are Jews who need help now. And he seceded from the Zionist movement and formed an organization called the JTO, the Jewish Territorial Organization. And here is part of their manifesto, text number 4. Immigration into particular centers cannot go long unchecked. Another law of human nature comes into operation to put brakes in it. A law, meaning a notion, formulated by the late Dr. Herzl, who had died 2 years early. And he's going to almost repeat what Herzl said in his first essay. The stream of immigration, following the lines of least resistance, flows into countries with the least anti-Semitism, but by its flowing it increases local anti-Semitism till a saturation point is reached and the immigration is restrained by law. This point is fast being reached in England. In America, the just published report of the Commissioner of the U.S. Immigration Bureau suggests drastic legislation in the same direction. Is it wise to wait until our hands are forced? Is it wise always to go on hoping that something which we know is bound to occur can be staved off a little longer? Would it not be wiser to face the possibility of all present ports being dosed to Jewish immigration? Should we not hasten while the gates are still open to find a land of refuge of our own? He's advocating for accepting the Uganda plan. Let's get something now. Now, what if Zangwill had been right and everyone had followed him? Would it have been different? I would suggest, there's a time element here. Until the beginning of the 1920s, going in a different direction was thoroughly unnecessary. They didn't need Uganda because they had the United States. As long as Jews could go to the United States, had they accepted the Uganda plan, nothing would have changed because the fact of the matter is, it's difficult to move. And if the Zionist movement had said, Uganda is our temporary homeland, very few Jews would have gone. Russian Jews would have said, I know it's hard here, but Uganda, where is that? It's in some place, some part of the world. Who wants to go to Uganda? So not that many would have gone. Now, a little bit later, when the situation got worse, if the Uganda plan had been accepted and Uganda had been a possibility, let's say in the 1930s or the 1940s, that would have been a place where Jews who were facing the difficulties of the late 1930s and would soon face the difficulties of the 1940s, that would have been a place to go. In other words, in the 1930s, there were hundreds of thousands of young Polish Jews who wanted to leave. They couldn't go to America, and the British had closed Palestine. Uganda might have been a place. I wish I could leave it there, but there's one more thing to consider, something that the British did not consider, something that Zangwill did not consider, something that Herzl did not consider. And it goes back to what I briefly mentioned, that Uganda was not empty. Zangwill, he was very European in the sense that he really had imbibed this notion of European colonialism. Zangwill, while he was still a Zionist, he described Palestine at the turn of the 20th century. He said, it's an ideal place to aspire for a Jewish homeland because Palestine is a land without people for a people without a land. Now, it wasn't a land without people. There were people who were there who pushed back. And the same thing would have been true of Uganda. This is where Herzl really was spot on. If enough Jews had moved to Uganda, the indigenous population of Uganda, who weren't the decision makers because Uganda was a British colony, and the indigenous Ugandans had no voice or say in anything. They were treated pretty badly by the British, would eventually have pushed back. And what that would have looked like? Not that different from what eventually looked like in Palestine. So there wouldn't have been a Jewish-Palestinian problem, but there would have been some kind of Jewish-Ugandan problem. Jews would have been seen as agents of British imperialism, and the indigenous population of Uganda, who really had never heard of anti-Semitism before, certainly not the modern racial type, would have discovered it. So it could have helped, but ultimately it would have created a similar kind of problem just someplace else. Okay? Now, like I said, that I think is a pretty straightforward proposition. That's what would have happened. Right. But let's turn to the other more complicated question. What if the Palestinians had said yes? So first, a little bit of background. When I say yes to the UN partition plan, the short version is, in 1947, after several decades of conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, the situation had gotten so bad, and the British had, well, my apologies to anyone here who is British, the British had proven themselves so inept at handling this situation. They had alienated everyone. They had, in many ways, they had favored the Arabs since the 1920s. By the end of the 1930s, the Arabs didn't like them either. It completely backfired. In 1947, remember, the British just finished fighting that devastating war, and it's estimated there was one British soldier or police officer for every 50 people in Palestine, which is a huge number at a time when the British government was broke. They wanted out of that, so they referred the matter to the United Nations. Now, this is where, for us in the 21st century, the challenge is we have to unglue ourselves from our late 20th or 21st century perspective, because we see that moment today through what we would call the Arab-Israeli conflict, through a broader Middle Eastern conflict. In 1947, the struggle between Jews and Arabs in Palestine was really more akin to what we might call a civil war. It was two groups of residents in Palestine, each of whom had national and religious and political aspirations for statehood in the same place, each of whom were making a religious claim and a national claim and a legal claim based on promises by the British Mandate to the same land, and they were beginning to fight over it. That's really the background to that moment. In other words, in 1947, this wasn't yet a conflict between the Zionist movement or the State of Israel and all of the Arab neighbors. They were not really involved yet. The other thing to keep in mind is that to this point, in the Arab in the Muslim world of the Middle East, there were two kinds of nationalism. There were two kinds of Arab nationalism. There was the more conventional kind, which is associated with a territory. So there was Iraqi nationalism, Egyptian, Syrian, Jordanian, etc. But there was another kind of Arab nationalism called pan-Arab nationalism, whose main belief was that not that the region would be broken up into individual states, but there was this larger solidarity of all Arab peoples, and that would be formed into some kind of federation, which would include Palestine. Incidentally, the British government 2 years before the Balfour Declaration, they had made a clandestine promise to Arab leaders that they were actually going to support that idea. When I say the British being inept, they managed to promise the same territory to two national groups. In many ways, that's really the beginning of the problem, okay? But in 1947, this still was more of a local problem than it was a regional problem. Now, it would become a regional problem really quickly, but it was still local. In other words, if you had asked Arabs in 1947 outside of Palestine, in Damascus, or in Cairo, or in Riyadh, or Baghdad, what do you think of that? Not terribly interested. They weren't loving the idea of a Jewish state, but apart from this pan-Arab nationalism, no one really had the notion of an Arab state in Palestine. They saw Arabs in Palestine as part of a pan-Arab state that would be ruled from somewhere else, but not the kind of Palestinian nationalism that would come afterwards. So that's the background to what the United Nations offered. Okay, so the United Nations made this offer, the partition of Palestine, UN Resolution 181 for the partition of Palestine in 1947. Now, I'm pretty sure most of us have heard of the partition of Palestine. We know this event, sort of. I think part of the problem we have in understanding the event and then trying to understand alternative outcomes is that all of us know what the partition of Palestine is, and we all know the Palestinians rejected it. I'm going to go on a limb and say very few people have ever read that partition plan. It's one of the problems we have these days. Not only these days, we let other people read things for us, and we take their word for it, which I'm realizing that's exactly what you're doing right now with me. But it's different because, when I say I always make sense. But, and sometimes it's fine, but sometimes if we get into the habit of letting other people read things for us, sometimes the people who are telling us what to think are, well, not the best people to be telling us what to think. The one that comes to mind is, a former MMA fighter who hosted this goofy show on TV who has a podcast, and lots of people think what he says makes sense. Incidentally, that's Joe Rogan, if you've never heard that name before. How anybody listens to him, I have no idea. Anyway, I don't want to get off on that tangent, but I think it's worth to take a look at what the partition was, because as partitions go, and I know that when we think United Nations today, we assume, and not incorrectly, that the United Nations tends to be instinctively anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. But you have to keep in mind that the United Nations, during its founding years, was very different from what the United Nations eventually became, I would say at some point maybe in the 60s or the 70s. The United Nations originally, to be a member of the United Nations, you had to be a democracy. Or at least, if you weren't yet, you had to be actively working toward becoming a democracy. That's not true anymore. Probably half of the member states of the United Nations, maybe less, maybe a third, are countries that are not democracies, and they have no plans to become democracies. And I'm not just talking about illiberal democracies like Hungary and Poland. I'm talking about, autocracies and monarchies are United Nations members. So the United Nations countries that drafted United Nations Resolution 181, first of all, there was no predisposition to be anti-Israel because there was no Israel yet. And they also were not predisposed to be anti-Zionism because at this moment in time, Zionism was a national movement like all others. It was a movement of people, on behalf of people who had been persecuted, who deserved statehood. There was a lot of support and sympathy. They also recognized that the Arabs in Palestine, they also had a claim. They really were trying to reconcile it here. So it's very long. I want to just look at a few parts, and then we can think about what would have happened if the Palestinians accepted this. Really what I want to make clear is when I say if they had accepted, we got to be clear on what they would have accepted. So this is text number 5. Okay? These are just excerpts. Here's the prologue. The General Assembly, the United Nations, having met in special session at the request of the mandatory power, meaning England, the British mandate, to constitute and instruct a special commission to prepare for the consideration of the question of the future government of Palestine at the second regular session. Having constituted a special committee and instructed it to investigate all questions and issues relevant to the problem of Palestine, and to prepare proposals for the solution of the problem, and having received and examined the reports from the special committee, this is UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, including a number of unanimous recommendations, considers that the present situation in Palestine is one which is likely to impair the general welfare and friendly relations among nations, not only between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, but it's likely to get bigger. Takes note of the declaration by the mandatory power that it plans to complete its evacuation of Palestine by August 1st, 1948, and it notes the fact that the British are leaving, they're giving it up. Recommends to the United Kingdom as the mandatory power for Palestine and to all other members of the United Nations the adoption and implementation with regard to the future government of Palestine of the plan of partition with economic union set out below. Now, everyone knows about the partition. I think the part that most people don't know is the economic union part. So we'll get to that in a minute. All right. So let's read a little bit of it. What's actually in it? So part one, the future constitution and government of Palestine. What does it mean for it to be partitioned? Okay. So first, there's termination of the mandate. The mandate for Palestine shall terminate. The independent Arab and Jewish states and the special international regime for the city of Jerusalem set forth in Part 3 of this plan shall come into existence in Palestine 2 months after the evacuation. So first and foremost, what the partition meant taking the area known as Palestine and dividing it, and there would be a Jewish part and there would be a Palestinian part, and the city of Jerusalem would have special status. It would be under international supervision. So first, let's just put a pin in that and imagine if no one was fighting over Jerusalem because Jerusalem was being shared. That would definitely simplify things. Okay, another part. Holy places, religious buildings, and sites. One of the concerns was, Jews and Arabs in Palestine were very concerned that if someone else was governing, they wouldn't have access. So for Jews, this was very real. If you were in Israel before 1967, you know that East Jerusalem had been under Jordanian control, and previously, it was dominated by Arabs, and there were Arab houses like right up to the Kotel, 5 feet from we've all seen the pictures. There were Arabs throwing garbage out their window onto the Kotel. Jews were concerned they wouldn't have access. Arabs were concerned that if Jews got access, then Arabs wouldn't have access to the mosques. Okay, so the partition dealt with that. Holy places, religious buildings, and sites. Existing rights in respect of holy places and religious buildings or sites shall not be denied or impaired. Insofar as holy places are concerned, the liberty of access, visit, and transit shall be guaranteed in conformity with existing rights to all residents and citizens of the other state and the city of Jerusalem. Which means if you wind up in the Jewish part of the partition, you have access to the Jewish sites in the Palestinian part, in the Arab part of the partition. So, as we'll see, the Jewish part of the partition did not include, let's say, Hebron, where Machpelah is, or Shechem, where there's what's also a holy site. Jews are guaranteed access in the same way that Arabs would be. Everyone would have access everywhere. Okay. Next, religious and minority rights. Freedom of conscience and the free exercise of all forms of worship, subject only to the maintenance of public order and morals, shall be ensured to all. In other words, in both states, no discrimination of any kind shall be made between the inhabitants on the ground of race, religion, language, or sex. All persons within the jurisdiction of the state shall be entitled to equal protection of the laws. Now, this means if you're Jewish and you want to continue to live in the part of the partition that's Arab, you are a full citizen and your rights are fully recognized, and vice versa. This is the creation of two liberal states with full rights for all. So you just have to imagine that the state that was envisioned here is very different from, let's say, what it means to be Palestinian living in Gaza right now, where there are no rights for anybody. Okay. Next. All right. Citizenship. Palestinian citizens residing in Palestine outside the city of Jerusalem, as well as Arabs and Jews who, not holding Palestinian citizenship, reside in Palestine outside the city of Jerusalem, shall, upon the recognition of independence, become citizens of the state in which they are resident and enjoy full civil and political rights. You know, a lot of this language is very similar to the language of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. And, well, for that matter, a lot of this is very similar to the language of the U.S. Constitution. Persons over the age of 18 years may opt, within 1 year from the date of recognition and independence of the state in which they reside, for citizenship of the other state, providing that no Arab residing in the area of the proposed Arab state shall have the right to opt for citizenship in the proposed Jewish state, and no Jew residing in the proposed Jewish state shall have the right to opt for citizenship in the proposed Arab state. Now, you're saying it means if you're Jewish, you can't be a citizen of the other state? You're not going to be a full citizen, but your minority rights are going to be respected and recognized. The exercise of this right of option will be taken to include wives and children, okay? And then Arabs residing in the area of the proposed Jewish state and Jews residing in the area of the proposed Arab state who have signed a notice of intention to opt for citizenship of the other state shall be eligible to vote in the elections of the Constituent Assembly of that state, but not in the elections of the Constituent Assembly of the state in which they reside. In other words, you get to choose to be citizens of one, you don't get to be citizens of both. You get to choose where you live. If you live in one, you can be a citizen of the other. So it's trying to create a symmetry and a balance here. Okay, that's the complexities of politics and citizenship. But here's what I mean about the economic union. You know, and this is actually a much longer section. I put a little bit here, but I think this is an important part of it. The objectives of the economic union of Palestine shall be a customs union, a joint currency system providing for a single foreign exchange rate, operation in the common interest on a non-discriminatory basis of railways, interstate highways, postal, telephone, and telegraphic services, and ports and airports involved in international trade and commerce. Joint economic development, especially in respect of irrigation, land reclamation, and soil conservation. Access for both states and for the city of Jerusalem on a non-discriminatory basis to water and power facilities. Now, this part I think is very important because this economic cooperation and agricultural cooperation and industrial cooperation, this wasn't inventing something new. This was just addressing the economic and agricultural and industrial reality of Palestine during the years before the 1940s. A lot of this was already happening. I'm going to give you an example. You know, in 1926, there was a proposal called Valley of the Jordan. It was a proposal to develop the flow of water in the Jordan, along the Jordan River, which is not a lot of water, but it's some water, especially in the winter, and to build a series of hydroelectric plants. And it would require the cooperation of Jews and Arabs in the region on both sides of the Jordan. Now, it was scrapped for political reasons. It never went anywhere. But if this economic union had come into being, if a possibility had been created of actual economic cooperation between, or continuing economic cooperation between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, that would have been an important piece of the problem, or important piece of the solution to the problem, I should say. You know, economic cooperation, when suddenly you have people from the two groups who not only stand to gain, but they have a vested economic interest in cooperating with each other. I think you'll agree, sometimes there are people who don't like each other or disagree with each other, but when they're in a situation where they actually have a chance not only to profit, but to improve their quality of life, they will work together. At least it's possible if the animosity is not hyped up too much. And I want to be clear, this is a proposal in 1947 at a point where there wasn't Jews or Arabs looking at or rejecting a sovereign state. Neither Jews nor Arabs had a sovereign state at this point. Okay. And finally, the city of Jerusalem, all right? This, I think, was probably the most effective part of the plan, the most ambitious, certainly. The city of Jerusalem shall be established as a corpus separatum, a separate entity, an independent political entity under a special international regime, and shall be administered by the United Nations. Remember, this isn't today's United Nations. This is the 1947 United Nations. This is the United Nations that still, well, without being overly cynical about the United Nations now, this is the United Nations that still had real values. We still believed in things and really had a real sense of optimism. This is in the immediate post-war world. Okay, one more thing to look at about the partition. Look at page number 3. I put a little map of how the territory was going to be partitioned. And this is what I mean about trying to unglue ourselves from our 21st century perspective. Because when we post-1967, when we look at this map, the first thing we see is that little, that Israel, that's that little sliver, and how vulnerable that, all of that. We see that now. The Zionist executive, the Zionist movement, and I would say most Jews in the world weren't seeing that, this map, as opposed to the post-67 map. They were seeing something better than nothing. The Jewish side, they accepted that partition immediately. Yeah, they were a little disappointed that they weren't going to have Jerusalem as a Jewish city, but truth of the matter is, one of those unusual points in the history of Zionism, a lot of secular Zionists especially, yeah, they had a connection to Jerusalem, but Tel Aviv was more important. Jerusalem is a nice thing to aspire to, but in terms of statehood, Jerusalem wasn't that economically important. It was something to aspire for the future, but they were more than happy to take it. And the other thing, the way this map was created in 1947 is they basically, all the areas that had mainly Jews, Zionist settlements, would become part of the Jewish state, and the areas that are primarily Arab would be part of the Arab state. In other words, according to this partition plan, there would have been very little in the way of people having to move if they wanted to be governed by their own people. This wasn't going to be the India-Pakistan fiasco where 20 million people had to change sides and it led to civil war. Actually, as partition plans go, I think we got to give it to the United Nations. This was good. This was well crafted and well thought out, and even though they were dealing with a lot of tension, a lot of conflict, a lot of dissatisfaction and discontent, they did a pretty good job balancing the needs and the aspirations of both peoples. So, let's imagine now, if the Palestinians accepted it, we would have had these two states. Now, like I said, the first thing we're going to see is a security problem. We're going to see vulnerability. Because what actually did happen was a state of Israel was declared, and then there were a series of wars. But I would point out that those wars were not instigated by Arabs in Palestine. They were instigated by international Arab leaders. It was an invasion more than it was the Arabs in Palestine trying to grab everything. Now, after the War of Independence, this is where it really changed. During the War of Independence, this is the moment when Arab leaders around the Middle East, this is when they said to the Palestinians, if you leave your homes, you'll get everything. That problem didn't really exist before 1948, and it didn't exist here. So the first thing I would say is if the Palestinians had accepted this plan, the notion of a Palestinian refugee problem does not exist. And there would have been further development of economic cooperation by people who were already neighbors and oftentimes friends and neighbors for a long time. Remember, these are two peoples. One of the reasons they have this connection to this little piece of land is they have a deep family history there. They've lived there for decades, in some cases for generations. They would have had reasons to share it. And it would have preempted the conflict from being transformed from something local, from a civil war between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, into this larger regional conflict where Arabs across the region are trying to destroy this Jewish state. So, of course, you ask, well, what if they had the partition and you have the two states? Wouldn't the Arab leaders have wanted to destroy it anyway? Maybe. But at that point, Arabs in Palestine would have had something very real to lose. Because the way it did turn out is they had nothing to lose. By rejecting this partition plan, they weren't losing statehood because they didn't have it yet. And one of the things that came out after the War of Independence, not only an established state of Israel, but a kind of sometimes tacit, sometimes open agreement between the neighbors, the Arab neighbors of Israel, that we don't need and we don't want to have an Arab state of Palestine because that will impede the effort to get all of it. But it wasn't Palestinian Arabs who were the loudest voices saying that. In other words, Palestinian Arabs got subsumed in larger regional aims. One last point too. One of the biggest problems that Palestinians have today in trying to do anything is, one of the things they really lack is a first-rate indigenous Palestinian leadership. It's one of the biggest problems in the efforts by Israel to make peace with the Palestinians. Let me give you this contrast, okay? You know, if you're old enough to remember before Sadat came to Jerusalem, remember in the early 1970s, the idea of Israel making peace with anybody was so remote and so hard to imagine, and it happened because Sadat came to Israel, which was miraculous. And remember, Sadat, before he came to Israel, was the loudest anti-Israel voice. He was shouting louder than anyone, "Throw the Jews into the sea." He did a kind of 180. Now, he didn't do a 180 primarily out of a love of Jews or Israel or any of that. He did what was best for his own people. He acted in Egyptian self-interest, and he offered the possibility of negotiation, and he was met by Menachem Begin. And the reason that negotiation happened, part of it was the timing, the exhaustion of war, but it doesn't happen if you don't have strong, visionary leaders on both sides. You had a strong Israeli leader, and you know, Begin was Begin. And you had a strong Egyptian leader. They were able to negotiate that. And it worked, and it still works, thank God. Now contrast that to what eventually happened when Israel was negotiating with the Palestinians. Let's say, the very different outcome of the Oslo Accords. Now on the Israeli side, you had Yitzhak Rabin negotiating. Yitzhak Rabin was just a towering presence as Begin was. He was one of the founders. Whatever your politics are in Israel, Rabin was Rabin. You might have disagreed with his politics, but whoever you were as an Israeli, he was the guy who captured the Kotel. He was the guy in the picture with the soldiers at the wall. End of story. He was that guy. He was in the Palmach. He was one of the founders of the country. So you had this strong, visionary leader on the Israeli side, but here's where it was different. Instead of Sadat, there was Arafat. And one thing we know about Palestinian leadership is there really has never been a good, homegrown Palestinian leadership. Palestinian leadership has been either corrupt, and Arafat, we had hope. Remember, we had hope that he actually might turn out to be another Sadat? It didn't happen that way, because he wasn't. And one of the reasons he wasn't is, although he was Palestinian, he was very much, he was very much under the influence of a broader international outlook, anti-Israel outlook. He couldn't unglue himself from, we need to destroy the state of Israel, which Sadat was able to do. That lack of leadership was absolutely crucial. And remember, from then until now, there still is no effective, strong Palestinian leadership. How different the situation would be if there was a strong Israeli leader negotiating with a strong Palestinian leader. It's never happened. Rabin tried. He was the right guy for the job. He thought he was pushing it through. Who knows, if he had lived a little bit longer, if he hadn't been killed, maybe he could have pushed it. Sharon, the same thing, another strong Israeli leader. But on the other side, they were talking to nobody, and they haven't discovered that person yet. But if they had accepted the partition, if they had begun the process of state building, then the Palestinians would have two things. The first, they would have strong leadership, but also they would have vested interests. If they had built a Palestinian economy in this partition state, if they had built a Palestinian infrastructure there, they would actually have something to lose. You know, we see echoes of it in a way, because for the most part, you know, the Palestinians in Gaza, who are largely poor, impoverished, they have nothing, they're much more desperate and much more willing to fight. Whereas Palestinians in the West Bank, who, yes, they fight, definitely, but many more of them are middle class, who have something to lose. If they had accepted the partition plan, there would have not only been individual Palestinian families, there would have been a Palestinian people that actually had something to lose, and that really changes the calculus. The way I see it looking back, that would have been a Palestinian entity that would have been much more willing, in the balance between the reasons we don't like Israel and the reasons we do, well, the economic union would have played a greater role, because it would have been tried. They would have experienced it. What does it mean to have a common currency with a Jewish state? Wow, the schools are all better. The infrastructure is better. We're all better off. The problem is that it wasn't enabled to come into being before the larger rhetoric and the larger propaganda, I guess, of that is an unacceptable solution became the dominant way of thinking. So first of all, I would say that for themselves, I mean, look, I'm not Palestinian, so I can't speak for Palestinians. But it's hard for me to imagine that if I was Palestinian right now, I wouldn't be looking back at that moment, given the situation that the Palestinians are in right now, with a little bit of regret. Oh, if only. See, I can't speak. It really seems that way. And, you know, I have heard Palestinians say it. I haven't heard Palestinian leaders say it. They're still buying in the other rhetoric. But I think also from the vantage point of the eventual state of Israel that came into being, instead of having a part of the country that is inherently antagonistic, it would be different. Well, first of all, if nothing else, that part of the country wouldn't have been part of Jordan for 19 years. And remember, that's also a part of the problem, because we now know that the Jordanians, who controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem, they didn't really want the Palestinians either. The king of Jordan was also concerned. They were also sort of pushing things in a different direction. And then, of course, the problem of the refugees, which may never have come into being. So there was an opportunity here. Now, here I'm going to come back to what I said at the outset. Remember I said at the outset that other events happened long ago, that we can speak about them with a certain historical perspective. What I just finished saying, really, this is a little bit of speculation. We don't know this for sure. You know, but the one thing I would say is it's tempting to look at what did happen and say that's the only thing that could have happened. Part of the problem is now there is so much animosity, so much bad blood, both metaphorical and literal. It's difficult to see that possibility. But in 1947, at that point in time, there already was a lot of economic cooperation. There were a lot of people on both sides who wanted more of it, who might have welcomed it. But the road down the other path started with the refusal of the Palestinians to accept this partition. I'll make one last point. The refusal of the Palestinians to accept this partition, it wasn't a one-time thing. It created a mentality or a pattern or a habit. I don't even know what to call it. Well, maybe a pattern is the best word. From this point on, the knee-jerk reaction of Palestinian Arab nationalists from this point on was to reject any proposal the same way they rejected this one. They didn't have a taste of what going in a different direction might have been. If they had tasted it, things might have turned out differently. And a different group of leaders would have come to the forefront. And I'll conclude with this example. Abbas, the current leader of the PA, before when he was Arafat's sort of one of his right-hand man or something like that, when he became an official, not the leader of the PA, he really wanted the PA to be something viable and to mature into the real bona fide core of a Palestinian state. And he wanted to, first and foremost, do away with the corruption. I remember there was an expose about him in the New York Times Magazine, I think in maybe 1993. He was sort of introducing Abbas to an American audience, an American Jewish audience. And they were giving the ideas that he wanted to do, how to make this plan for a Palestinian state more viable. And one of them was, he said, you want to get rid of corruption, you want to be able to create a state that's more viable. He said the first thing you have to do is you have to have direct deposit for Palestinian police officers. Now that sounds like such a little thing, but the reason that was significant is most Palestinian police officers in the PA, then and now, they get paid by their commanding officer, and their commanding officer basically, at his own disposal can say, no, I'm not giving you anything. You not only have to do your job well, you have to believe the right thing. Where if it had been direct deposit, then they wouldn't have been beholden to a particular individual to get paid. Now, that notion is a little thing, but it's right out of the economic union plan of the Palestinian partition plan. Now, everybody knows what this partition plan was. Everybody knows what it could have been. The distance, the time between then and now, well, it's always difficult to turn back the clock. But if it had gone a different way, the outcome could have been a lot better. Toda rabah. Thank you very much, everybody. All right. Now, I'm going to guess there's going to be some questions. Yes, sir. I'll repeat the question if you can't hear. Go ahead. The question was, who on the Zionist side voted to accept the partition? Was it one person, one vote? It was the Zionist executive that accepted it, but the Zionist executive was democratically elected by Jews on the Yishuv. So it'd be like, a Zionist organization. So it wasn't every single person, but it was the representatives of every single person. I would also say that in 1947, the Zionist executive was not an elite group. This wasn't the AJC, okay? Most of the Zionist executives were kibbutzniks, were people from town. It was a pretty decent cross-section of the Jewish population. There weren't a lot of Haredim on the Zionist executive because most of them didn't want to be, but it represented a sizable portion of the Yishuv and a pretty representative cross-section of the Yishuv. So, does that answer your question? On the Jewish side. On the Palestinian side, it never got to a vote. On the Palestinian side, there were Palestinians who wanted to accept it, but before they had a chance to accept it, Arab leaders from neighboring countries waited and said, you know what, we are not going to accept it. In some ways, they weren't fully given the right to accept or reject because they were subsumed in this larger concern. And some of their own leaders, let's say, their own religious leaders, they weren't only local leaders, they were regional leaders, the Husseini family. And they said, no, we're not going to accept this. The other problem they had, and this is a problem that they had that at this point, the Jews on the Jewish side didn't have, although they're kind of getting into the situation now, is there was a lot of, in the Palestinian leadership, there was a lot of religious and theological leadership who said their problem with accepting this was partly motivated by, it's against Islam to have something that's sovereign, non-Muslim in this region. On the Israeli or the Zionist or Israeli side, they had the advantage of they could keep religion out of it. And we all know how toxic that mix is. There was already on the Palestinian side some religious influence. The muftis didn't want this at all. And that gets in the way of everything. Good question. Yeah, Norm. The number of Jews on the issue was about 600,000, yeah.
Now we've got 7 million.
Yes.
So it was really not a feasible solution for the long-term building of the Jewish state.
Why was the growth from 600,000 to 7 million not a viable solution? In other words, if the state had stayed this size, it would have been too small? Even this part of the state, a lot of it is underdeveloped. Even what's on this, there are parts of the Galilee, even right now, where you could build settlements, you could build towns. So, there definitely is the notion that there wasn't enough room, a little bit of a fiction. Especially the ingenuity of Israeli technology. And we know the phrase, making the desert bloom. If there had been a need, then it wouldn't have been only Beersheba and Arad. There would have been a dozen of those cities, and there would have been enough room. And there would have been, I hear what you're saying. And, there wouldn't have been enough room for everyone to live in Tel Aviv. Although there are actually more people more now in Tel Aviv than that. But yes, if the need had been, they would have found room for everybody. Because because the ingenuity is remarkable. I think the population problem might have been bigger on the other side. But I think in that situation, before the refugee problem, I think some Palestinians would have left. But remember, also with an economic union, it would have been easier to borrow the technology to develop. The whole area would be more developed. You know how the West Bank is just a bunch of rocks? There would have been more cities and towns there, more irrigation, more agriculture. That they never got. Yeah.
The British in India were sick of the Hindus and Muslims fighting, so they say, we're leaving partition, you guys will kill each other.
Right.
1 year later, Jews and Arabs that say the same thing, we're leaving partition, you guys will kill each other. Are they not related?
The question was what the British did in India with the Hindus and Muslims, basically leaving them to fight each other, is the same thing they did in Palestine. Similar. 1 year later. The reason the British did it in both cases is, it was for their own self-interest. India was already independent. There was no stopping Gandhi. Britain was out of money. They weren't getting any money from India anymore. They wanted to have some kind of trade relations with this new country, so it was in their own interest. And the same thing in Palestine. There was really no reason to hold on to it anymore. If you don't have India, you don't need the Suez Canal as much. They were at that point, they were more interested in Middle Eastern oil. The one difference is when they left India, they really just left and didn't take sides. When they left Palestine, they kind of left all the military equipment for the Arabs to get. Classically British thing to do. They did it a little bit less neutrally, if that's a word. Yeah, Al.
Would you consider commenting on what's going on in Gaza and what's happening?
You mean right now?
Well, I know it's a big subject.
I don't think, will I comment on what's happening right now? A little Inyana Dioma, affairs of the day. I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen. I think really, this is where the story really begins. If we were just watching this dispassionately as a movie, this is where it really heats up. Until now, the protesters were protesting the passage of a law. Now they're going to be protesting the existence of a law, and it is going to intensify in a lot of ways. Now we're going to find out what all those reservists not going to the army means. So far, it's been a lot of talk and a lot of threats and promises. And Bibi, being Bibi, he is calling this is one of the biggest calling of the bluffs he's ever done. He's always managed to pull this off in the past, but Bibi isn't Bibi anymore. We really could use Bibi from 20 years ago, who was able to smooth over anything, but that's not that guy anymore. And his partners are very different now. So beyond that, who knows? This is a very vast situation. This is unexplored territory. This is uncharted territory. I wish, I know there are Israelis who are despairing. Danny Gordis, for example, is one. But there are also Israelis who still have hope that the situation is salvageable. But no one really knows. Ask me again in 6 months what this looks like. I think even 3 or 6 months, there is no one in the world who knows what this is going to look like. But when it does, we'll have a clearer sense of what all of this means. But for now, if you're someone who loves Bibi, you got to acknowledge the fact that he is playing a very dangerous game right now. He has doubled down and then doubled down and then doubled down. He's really going all in. I did read, there was an interesting comment, and this is written by someone who is critical of Bibi. He said the difference between a statesman and a demagogue is that a statesman puts the interests of the country ahead of his own interest. A demagogue puts his interests ahead of those of the country. So, but like I said, we don't know exactly. The hope is, even if you don't like Bibi, he's always figured out a way to sort of, retreat a little bit in a way where he can save face. He's always managed to pull something out. And you were sort of hoping that, oh, here's the solution I've been holding on to. Maybe. If not, probably the best scenario is another election. There's another election. It'll be a very different government. And then they can start solving the problems that way. That's the best I got. That's the best. That's all guessing. Yes, Bob. Thanks, Alan.
Back with Arafat and Camp David, he was close to agreeing to the solution, but then he came out and said that he was afraid for his life, that they were threatening to kill him. He changed his mind.
Yeah, the notion is Arafat was close to agreeing. I think I would just qualify it. See, with Arafat, we have to be careful. He said he was close to agreeing. It turns out, and he might have been, but it turns out when you look at everything Arafat said and did, it's really tough. The guy has zero credibility because really at the end of the day, as much as he claimed to be acting in the best interests of the Palestinians, he was acting in the best interests of Arafat. But he was right that if he had signed that thing, he would have been dead. No, they would have tried to kill him. He's also very hard to catch. He would have disappeared somewhere in Tunisia or Algeria or somewhere, but it wouldn't have been the Mossad hunting him down. It would have been, it would have been Palestinians trying to find him. It eventually would have been Hamas trying to kill him if he had signed. So, I'll admit, he saw what happened to Sadat. Sadat lasted maybe 3 or 4 years before he was killed. He saw what happened to Rabin, and he had to wonder, in this volatile situation, you make this deal. A lot of people who make this deal, a lot of statesmen who make this deal don't live very long to talk about it. And Arafat was, I think above all, he was concerned with Arafat. He was a survivor. He just wanted to keep on going. Yeah, Jerry.
On that very subject, when the tanks went through his fortress where he was holding up before he ran off to France, or he was taken to France, I think it's fair to say, they found boxes of receipts for arms. The Hawaii Accord was in August, and all these were June and July, where he had ordered all these weapons for the Intifada.
Right. We could make a laundry list of the times where Arafat was not telling the truth. That's a given. There was a lot of BS in what he was saying, for sure. Yeah.
I'm just very curious about who was on that special committee that developed the plan.
Yeah.
How in the world did they agree on who would be on the committee?
Great question. Who on the United Nations? Well, as the United Nations go, it was half the members of the Security Council. Now remember also, the United Nations was a lot smaller. It was a much more selective group. And the group of countries that were on the United Nations in 1947, I would suggest it almost didn't matter who it was. These were countries who, they really believed in the ideals of the United Nations, in the United Nations as an organization that would broker peace, even between the most contentious opponents. I mean, they weren't always able to do it. So there were representatives, there were UN representatives from every continent on Earth, except maybe Australia. They were from South America, from Europe. I mean, you can Google the specific representatives. It was a cross-section of the countries who were participating. They're all bringing different experiences, different points of view. The one thing they did agree on, though, is that there had to be an economic component to it. Okay, and the two states that came out of this partition had to be liberal and democratic states. That was the best hope for this working. It was one of the reasons in their mind why, for example, what happened in India and Pakistan didn't work, is it wasn't an entrenched notion of liberal or democracy in that part of the world yet. The people didn't quite understand it. So this plan was designed that the people who would be immediately benefiting from it, not only the leadership, they would recognize that it's in both their best interests for the situation to go in this direction, and in any other direction they would be worse off. Now on the Jewish side, immediately they saw, yes, all we want is some sovereignty, and they were going to get it. The Palestinians, they might have, if it had just been them, but they had all these other voices in their head. Yeah.
Two things. Number one, if there would have been a civil war,
Yeah.
there would have been.
Yeah.
One would be Jews who were in DP camps in Europe before 48, 49, come to Israel. And the second is that the Muslim countries have thrown out over 1 million Jews from Syria, Algeria,
Great questions. Let me repeat them both. So the first one was, if there had been a civil war between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, would Holocaust survivors who were in DP camps, would they still wanted to come to Israel? And there I would say that civil war was already happening. It began in November of 1947, and many of the DPs came anyway. You know, many of them who were coming towards Cyprus, they were arriving in Cyprus when the civil war was already happening. I think that the desire to go to a sovereign Jewish state for DPs was not going to be deterred by the particular situation. Now, the other question is, what were the implications of this had been for Jews who were living in Muslim countries who, after the founding of the State of Israel, the conditions deteriorated and they were ultimately tossed out? That is a great question. Now, on the one hand, if the conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine had simmered down a little bit, the backlash would have been diminished. But the problem is that they weren't, this animosity towards Jews, first of all, it was already going on for about 10 years. And it was prompted not by the lack of statehood for Palestinian Arabs, it was prompted by the existence of a Jewish state in the Middle East. You know, there was this notion that regardless of what that state is, Zionism was problematic for that reason. You know, it's one of the things that Palestinians, you know, they've discovered over the years is that they're not really, the Arabs, the Arab coalition against Israel often doesn't care about Palestinian Arabs. They have different issues that's independent of that. I think that would have gone exactly the same way. I think most of those Jews, the situation would have deteriorated, and those who were going to come to Israel were going to come to Israel, and then normally they would have had to figure out where to put them. But, you know, they might have done, eventually they would have figured it out. You know, it didn't happen right away. But, so on the one hand, yeah, the DPs would still have come. The other, I think, also would have probably been the same. I don't think that would have been affected. It's a great question.
I think you've been a little too optimistic.
Always, you know me.
What the Arab state would have done.
Right.
Because they had no history of any kind of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't even know what democracy was. So why do you think that Arab state would have functioned as a democratic system is puzzling me.
Did everyone hear the question? The Arabs in Palestine had very little experience with democracy. I think that was true, except they did have 20 years history of democracy living under the British Mandate. Because the British Mandate, it wasn't a full democracy, but one of the things the British, being a democratic country, they were trying to build those kinds of institutions, trying to educate those ideas. So I would say that while Arabs in Palestine certainly didn't have as much a notion of democracy as, you know, Zionists who came from Europe or America did, they were probably the most aware of democracy. They had more exposure to democracy than any other Arabs in the Middle East. So I hear your question, and that is a big if. They didn't have much experience, but they had some, and they did have 20 years of seeing that. You know, in a democratic country, the infrastructure is better, the education is better, the water is better, the jobs are better. You know, I mean, it's basically the equivalent of day of, wow, we have really good Wi-Fi because we're in a democratic country. So maybe. I think that's a great question. I think you're also right by saying, and maybe I'm too optimistic, they could have slid back to those old habits. unless they already had some vested interest of not doing it. They were just never given the vested interest. So I would agree I'm optimistic, but I'm cautiously optimistic. And I think there's a little bit of reason to be optimistic there. Yeah.
Getting back to the Supreme Court, how do the judges are going to be Supreme Court judges?
What's the question? How do the judges? Oh, how are the judges appointed? There's a Knesset committee that appoints the judges. It's an intricate committee. It's an intricate process. It's not like here where they're just sort of appointed and have to be approved. They have to be approved by the Knesset, by a majority of the Knesset, but the appointment starts with a kind of committee. It isn't the prime minister or the president who nominates them. So it's like our process in certain ways. It's a little different in other ways. Okay? Yeah. Great question. Like I said before, I'd have to Google that. If you just Google it. But what you'll see is that it was countries from all over the world. It was a pretty fair cross-section of countries, member countries of the United Nations. If you're wondering, no, Syria and Jordan were not on that. They weren't there. The Soviet Union wasn't part of it either. But
The thrust of my question is the major players, the European powers,
right.
the British, France was coming back from devastation and occupation, and the British economy was a shambles. But yet the British still wanted to maintain their influence with the oil-rich nations.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, when the Jewish committee and the Palestinian committee had input to the UN, I have a feeling that was a very small portion of these rules. These rules sound a lot like imperial powers saying,
this is what you're going to do. This is what you're going to do. The question is not only who were the countries that designed this partition plan, but how much influence did Jews and Arabs actually had. Turns out a lot of what this was, this partition plan was based on earlier British hearings that were held during the 1930s called the Peel Commission. Because the Peel Commission, already in the 1930s, was already figuring out a way, well, maybe we should just partition this thing, and we can alleviate civil war that way. So they weren't starting from scratch in 1947. They were starting with this British plan, but when you had other countries in mind, it sort of, let's say, it rounded the edges of the British plan, because the British plan for partition was really designed in the best interests only of the British. How can we partition? How can we partition the country and satisfy these two peoples to bring the most money and allegiance to Great Britain and to the crown? When all the other countries I think it was becoming something genuinely fairer. But now you are also right. These are European and other countries who are basically going to this part of the world and saying, we know better, this is what you're going to do. But I think that what they came up with was pretty good. I mean, it was a pretty fair plan for everybody. If it had been accepted, it might have been workable. Maybe. Hard to know. Yeah.
How do you see in the future, do you see any way to solve the problem between
Israel and the Palestinians? Is there any? The future's. I'll give you the two-sentence answer. Okay. First, some conflicts don't end through victory or defeat. Some conflicts end through exhaustion. Nobody won World War I. Both sides were exhausted. They had no resources. They had no will to fight. They stopped, and they figured out a way to stop. And figured out a way to solve. There are other large, long-standing conflicts that just end through exhaustion. So that's first of all. So I don't think Israel and the Palestinians are exhausted yet, but I think they're more exhausted than they were 20 years ago. So it's going to be a little more time. But when both sides really don't want to do this anymore, it's going to end. Second thing is what I mentioned about leadership. You have to have not only good leaders, but you need to have leaders on both sides who have this kind of a towering enough presence that they can get the people to take a chance. Making peace with Sadat was a risk, and Begin got Israelis to take the risk. Making peace in Israel for Egyptians was a risk, and Sadat got them to do it. So strong leaders for sure. The one other thing I would mention, this was an observation made by former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. He made an analogy between Israel and the Palestinians and the fall of the Soviet Union. He said that the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990 happened at a moment when no one was around who still remembered the Russian Revolution, who could still personally remember why it started in the first place. And he said, it'll be easier, or maybe the possibility of resolving will have to wait until no one remembers the Nakba or the 1948 personally. When that happens, when it's only a memory, maybe it'll be easier. Now, he wasn't saying all we have to do is wait till everyone's... No. He's just saying that if what happened in the Soviet Union happens here, that'll be a step. So all those things together, maybe. The larger point is, I don't think it's happening anytime soon, but it's possible. I think the exhaustion thing and the leadership thing, the combination of those two things makes it possible. Because on both sides, everybody wants the conflict to be resolved, and everybody knows what the resolution looks like. The other problem is there are extremists who are impeding this. If we could pluck all the extremists out, I mean, on both sides, there would be peace the next day. I mean, that's a silly thing to say because we can't. And many of these extremists are very popular. But that's another part of the problem. If we could sort of, snap them out of existence and just have, moderate people who just want to live and, have a decent life, peace the next day. Peace the next day. I think we have time for one more question. Go ahead, Noah.
I was just going to say that as a historian, you would remember a period when there was constant war between France and Germany.
Yes.
And no one could visualize peace.
Right. Yeah, France and Germany were at war for 1,000 years, and they haven't been at war for what, 50, 70, 80 years? Probably due for a war, but who knows? Maybe we're past the point. Maybe they've gotten tired of fighting each other. Maybe nobody cares anymore. That's a remarkable example. They were fighting each other since the time of Charlemagne, and since the end of World War II, they haven't had a single fight. They've been playing so nicely for so long. Thank you, everybody.